In 1985, crack cocaine exploded onto American streets like a wildfire. Within 2 years, the crack epidemic had spread to every major city in the United States. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed, families were torn apart, and the government's response, the war on drugs, created consequences we're still dealing with 40 years later. But here's what most people don't know. The crack epidemic wasn't an accident. It was the result of economic policies, CIA operations in Central America, and systemic inequality that created the perfect storm. The war on drugs that followed, it was never really about stopping drugs at all. Welcome to the Mind Metrics, where we uncover the hidden truths behind history's most impactful events. I'm your host, and today we're unmasking the crack epidemic, examining how it started, why it devastated certain communities, and how the war on drugs response changed America forever. From crack houses in inner cities to the halls of government power, from the CIA's involvement in drug trafficking to the mass incarceration that followed, this is the stark reality of the crack epidemic that history books don't tell you. If you're ready to understand one of the most devastating chapters in American history, hit that like button and subscribe to the Mind Metrics. This story is darker than you think. Let's start with how the crack epidemic began, and it begins long before crack even existed. To understand the crack epidemic, we need to go back to the 1970s. America's inner cities were already in crisis. Deindustrialization had eliminated millions of manufacturing jobs. White flight had drained tax revenue from urban areas. Federal policies had systematically segregated communities and denied Black families access to wealth-building opportunities. By 1980, unemployment in Black urban neighborhoods exceeded 50% in some areas. Entire communities had been economically abandoned. This wasn't an accident. It was the result of decades of discriminatory policies. Then came cocaine. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, cocaine flooded into the United States from South America, particularly Colombia. But powder cocaine was expensive, a rich person's drug. It cost $100 or more per gram. Poor communities couldn't afford it. Now, that's when someone discovered that mixing cocaine with baking soda and water, then heating it, created a smokable form that was far cheaper to produce and incredibly addictive. They called it crack. Crack changed everything. A hit of crack could be sold for as little as $5 to $10, making cocaine accessible to impoverished communities for the first time. And because crack produced an intense but short-lived high, lasting only 5 to 10 minutes, users needed to buy more again and again and again. The crack epidemic was born. By 1985, crack had spread across American cities at a speed that shocked law enforcement, public health officials, and communities. The Drug Enforcement Administration reported that crack was available in 28 states. By 1987, it was everywhere. The crack epidemic hit hardest in communities that were already suffering. In neighborhoods where legitimate economic opportunities had vanished, the crack trade became one of the few ways to make money. Young men, many still teenagers, became street-level dealers. The profits were enormous. The risks were deadly. But here's where the crack epidemic gets even darker. Evidence suggests that the flood of cocaine into America wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was aided by the United States government itself. In the 1980s, the CIA was funding Contra rebels fighting the socialist Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Congress had banned direct U.S. funding of the Contras, so the CIA needed money from somewhere else. Investigative journalist Gary Webb documented in his Dark Alliance series that Contra-connected drug traffickers were flooding Los Angeles with cocaine. And the CIA knew about it and allowed it to continue. The cocaine that these traffickers imported was converted into crack and distributed throughout American cities, fueling the crack epidemic. The same government that would later declare a war on drugs was at minimum turning a blind eye to, and possibly facilitating, the drug trade that created the crack epidemic. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of the crack epidemic. The communities most devastated by crack were the same communities whose destruction may have been enabled by government policy. The human cost of the crack epidemic was catastrophic. Between 1984 and 1994, crack-related emergency room visits increased by more than 1,000%. Hospital admissions for cocaine-related issues skyrocketed. But the crack epidemic didn't just destroy individual lives, it destroyed entire communities. Crack addiction tore families apart. Children were abandoned or neglected by addicted parents. Mothers gave birth to babies exposed to crack in the womb, creating a generation of children facing developmental challenges. Violence exploded. As crack dealers competed for territory, murder rates in American cities spiked dramatically. In Washington, D.C., the murder rate doubled between 1985 and 1988. In New York City, crack-related homicides became the leading cause of death for young Black men. The crack epidemic created a landscape of urban decay. Abandoned buildings became crack houses, places where people would go to smoke crack, often in conditions of absolute squalor. Entire blocks became open-air drug markets. Children growing up during the crack epidemic witnessed violence, addiction, and death as daily realities. Communities that had already been economically devastated were now socially devastated as well. The crack epidemic didn't just affect drug users, it affected everyone living in these neighborhoods. Families who had nothing to do with drugs found themselves trapped in war zones. And then came the government's response: the war on drugs. But instead of treating the crack epidemic as a public health crisis requiring treatment and economic investment, the government treated it as a criminal problem requiring punishment. In 1986, at the height of the crack epidemic, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. This law created mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. And here's where it gets sinister. The law treated crack cocaine and powder cocaine completely differently. Possessing 5 grams of crack triggered a mandatory 5-year prison sentence. But to get the same sentence for powder cocaine, you needed 500 grams. That's a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity for chemically identical drugs. Why does this matter? Because powder cocaine was predominantly used by white Americans, while crack was predominantly used in Black communities. The crack epidemic's legal response wasn't colorblind, it was explicitly racial in its impact. The war on drugs during the crack epidemic led to mass incarceration on a scale never before seen in American history. Between 1980 and 2000, the U.S. prison population increased from 500,000 to over 2 million people. A huge percentage of those imprisoned were nonviolent drug offenders, many caught up in the crack epidemic. Black Americans were incarcerated for drug offenses at rates far exceeding their proportion of drug users. Despite similar rates of drug use across racial groups, Black Americans were nearly 6 times more likely to be incarcerated for drug offenses during the crack epidemic era. The war on drugs didn't stop the crack epidemic. It just imprisoned an entire generation. Fathers were taken from families. Young men received decades-long sentences for low-level crack offenses. Communities already devastated by the crack epidemic were further destroyed by mass incarceration. And here's the cruelest irony. While the government was imprisoning poor Black crack users for years, wealthy white powder cocaine users rarely faced serious consequences. The war on drugs was never about drugs. It was about control and punishment of specific communities. By the mid-1990s, crack use began declining. Why? Not because of the war on drugs, but because communities saw the devastation and rejected crack themselves. Younger generations watched what the crack epidemic did to their parents and communities, and they chose not to use. Additionally, treatment options slowly expanded, and some cities began implementing harm reduction strategies. The crack epidemic eventually burned itself out, but not before leaving permanent scars. Today, we're seeing a different drug epidemic: opioids. And the response has been starkly different. When opioid addiction hit predominantly white suburban and rural communities, the response emphasized treatment, compassion, and viewing addiction as a disease. The contrast with how the crack epidemic was handled couldn't be clearer. The crack epidemic revealed ugly truths about American society: how poverty and lack of opportunity create conditions for drug epidemics, how government policy can enable drug trafficking while punishing users, and how the criminal justice system treats different communities with completely different standards. So we've journeyed through the history of the crack epidemic, from its origins in economic devastation and possible CIA complicity, through its catastrophic impact on communities, to the racially disparate war on drugs response that imprisoned millions. Here's the ultimate truth about the crack epidemic. It was never just about drugs. The crack epidemic was about poverty, systemic racism, government policy, and who gets punished versus who gets help. The crack epidemic emerged because entire communities had been economically abandoned. When legitimate opportunities disappear, illegal economies fill the void. The crack trade wasn't the cause of urban poverty, it was the symptom. The crack epidemic was enabled by government policies, both the economic policies that created desperate conditions and the possible CIA involvement in drug trafficking that flooded cocaine into American cities. The crack epidemic devastated communities that were already suffering, tearing apart families and creating a generation of children who grew up surrounded by addiction and violence. And the war on drugs response to the crack epidemic wasn't about public health or helping people. It was about mass incarceration and social control. The 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine wasn't an oversight. It was policy that explicitly targeted Black communities. The crack epidemic's legacy continues today. Millions of people remain incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses from that era. Communities never fully recovered from the combined devastation of economic abandonment, the crack epidemic itself, and mass incarceration. The wealth gap between Black and white families widened during this period and has never closed. But the crack epidemic also teaches us lessons for today. When we look at current drug epidemics, we can see the difference between punishment-based approaches and treatment-based approaches. We can recognize that drug epidemics are public health crises that require economic investment, treatment access, and addressing root causes, not just arresting people. The crack epidemic shows us what happens when government policy fails communities, when law enforcement replaces economic opportunity, and when punishment replaces compassion. So what do you think? Did you know about the CIA's possible role in the crack epidemic? Were you aware of the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity? How do you think we should respond to drug epidemics differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. If this examination of the crack epidemic opened your eyes to the real history behind this devastating period, smash that like button and subscribe to the Mind Metrics. We uncover the hidden truths behind history's most impactful events, and there's plenty more to explore. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the crack epidemic's dark history. Remember, understanding the past is the first step toward building a better future. The crack epidemic wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific choices and policies. And that means different choices can create different outcomes. Until next time, this is the Mind Metrics. Stay curious, stay critical, and never accept the official story without questioning what's beneath the surface. The crack epidemic changed America forever. Now you know the real story.